Night is a talk show with published authors, writers, and content creators discussing both the creative and technical sides of writing, as well as the industry surrounding it, from novels to screenplays to comics and more. And now, here's your host, author Travis I. Sivart.
Welcome to Write Night. We'll get to the topic and discussion in just a moment. For those listening to the podcast, we record the podcast on our live stream at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and we have a live interactive chat audience. You might hear the sound of the bell ding, and that means I want to interrupt somebody to read a comment or question. For those on the live stream, we won't read off everything you put in chat, but we'll try to get to the most relevant, the most amusing, or some combination of the both. Now, while we introduce ourselves, go and let us know what you're reading, writing, or creating tonight. Okay, while you guys put that into chat, I'll let you know that I am Travis Sivart, and I am working on the edit of Silver and Smith Book 2. That should be out relatively soon. And let's introduce the beauty amongst us. Aaron?
Hi! Aaron Kennedy, author of Persona Non Grata, technical writer extraordinaire. Been published in the Army Times, NCO Journal. Also wrote Persona Non Grata, first of the Ships of Valor series, working on Icarus Black, set in the same universe. To you, Tara.
Hey, I'm Tara Moeller, and I am Dreamer-in-Chief at Dream Punk Press. We're the small publisher of big dreams. I'm also a published author under the pen name, E.G. Gaddis. And you can find all of my books and more at www.dreampunkpress.com.
Very good. And tonight's topic is the really broad spectrum topic of subgenres within fantasy and sci-fi. So there's a few big ones out there, and I'll just name off a few of these, and then we'll start splitting hairs and discussing different things. Under sci-fi, you can have military sci-fi, with spaceships. You can have just almost a fantasy sci-fi. In fantasy, you have swords and sorcery. You have epic fantasy. You have dark fantasy. There's always the YA versions of all of these. And most books have multiple genres just to cover what age group you're looking at and what kind of feel you have specifically. Now, I'll go ahead and say with a few of my books, in my medieval fantasy, and I always say medieval fantasy, I feel like fantasy leans towards erotica in some people's head, because when you have fantasies, but I probably could just say fantasy. I do have some epic fantasy as well as swords and sorcery. Swords and sorcery being a bit faster paced and lighter, more about the adventure than the long game. And most recently, Silver and Smith, as I mentioned that before, I made up my own genre, and we can go into this a little later if we want, and that is a mix of cyberpunk and pulp stories. I have trouble saying pulp fiction now because of the movie and the popularity of the movie, but pulp, as in the fast-paced, constant beats of the pulp genre from the 30s and 40s, a lot of detective novels and other things. So what about you guys? Who's got some intro stuff, maybe what you wrote in or what you like, or other major subgenres?
Well, see, and when you start rattling them off, I always like to go, okay, what are our examples? Is kind of the great ones, because you say, oh, okay, well, we got space fantasy. That's your classic Star Wars is one, which is a Western. You got your Western fantasies.
And Star Wars would be called space opera.
Right, yeah, that's space opera, absolutely. But that's your Flash Gordon as well as a space opera,
and pulp,
and pulp, exactly. And that because they cross-pollinate across all these things, which is amazing. Fifth Element is definitely a space opera. But,
literally.
Yeah, literally, right.
Literally.
But we get into the high fantasy and the epic fantasy, where your Lord of the Rings, your medieval fantasies, your Dragon Hearts and stuff like that. Your Game of Thrones is very much a medieval style.
That's also
Um,
epic fantasy.
it is. Um, but we start getting into the various flavors, but each one's got its own nuance of what you want. You got Gothic fantasy, which sways much more over into Tara's arena, um, but some of that sways back into the modern as well. You got things like Agyar, Stephen Brust's, which was set in contemporary times. But that was actually where I picked up the narrative style that I used over in Persona non Grata.
Mm-hmm.
The narrator never speaks, but the people that he's interacting with do. Um,
And Sapphire says modern fantasy. So, Tara, do
mhm.
you want to throw a few minutes worth of thoughts in here before we start dicing it all up?
Yeah, because we talk subgenres, and then
Mhm.
we also have crossovers and mix-ups of them, because you have, say, romance. It is in and
Mhm.
of itself probably one of the biggest genres out
Probably the
there.
biggest. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but then you also have romance fantasy. Is it fantasy or is it romance? And it all depends on, which you want to classify it as a lot of times. Because as everybody says, romance is almost always the B story. And so you can have romance that's steampunk,
Mm-hmm.
which is relatively disappointing for someone who likes to read and write steampunk. I read my first romance that was steampunk, and I'm like, I wanted it to be more steampunk. The steampunk was just
What?
hopping on the
Yeah.
bandwagon kind of thing. But so you have subgenres, whereas steampunk would be a subgenre for, say, sci-fi, and then you have crossover, and it just muddies the water everywhere.
Well, in
Aaron?
that realm, a lot of times where you find it in the bookstore is where the beats are, and that goes back to an earlier episode that we had. Whereas if you go to the romance section, it could be any one of these flavors of romance, but the beats are going to align to the romance. Whereas if we go and we look at um, like your Jacqueline Carries and things like that, they're definitely fantasy and they've got romance beats. Or excuse me, they're definitely fantasy beats with a romance B story. And that's where we flip the script on that side. Um, whereas you're. Go ahead, Travis.
Sorry to interrupt. Raven here, and I want to read this off for Tara. Says, "Oh, read the Cyborg Tinkerer by Meg Latour. Best steampunk romance ever." So there's a good recommendation for you. Go on, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, when we start looking at the beats and things like that, that's where we're going to find where it's going to be in the bookstore, and then our B sub story is going to be the crossover. Um, and you end up with, well, there's one on Amazon. I like Amazon Prime because a lot of times I get a book that I can check out for free.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas there's some that is like, oh, this is a harem novel. That's what the beats are. But it's a fantasy novel because they're pulling in all manner of whatever. I'm like, okay, it's cheesy and it's cheap, but it's a fast read, and I'll read 20 pages before I go to bed just to friggin' let the mind do its thing. But it's cheesy, but it delivers what it promises, and that's what I want out of a book.
To compare it to something, I'm going to compare it to food. You got Chinese food, you got Indian food, you got Italian food, you got French food, you got barbecue. But if you look at just Chinese food, you have chicken dishes, you have beef dishes, pork and seafood, but then you also have your General Tso's compared to a sweet and sour, compared to your sesame chicken. And they're all that, but there's subgenres that branch down into it, and you can mix and match, because if you hit that buffet, yeah, you're having all Chinese food, but now you're having some of this and this and this in there. And Aaron, you mentioning the beats is an interesting thing to bring up, because I don't think I've ever associated where my beats are when choosing a genre. I think I'm going for more the seasoning on the meal than is it Chinese food, Indian food, Italian food.
Well, okay, let's do this, okay? The Marvel Cinematic Universe does a great job with this,
It's
okay?
true.
They say, hey, we are going to make a spy movie. Which character will be great in this? And they made Winter Soldier, and they shoved Captain America, and they used his spy capabilities. That is probably one of the best spy movies ever made. They made a heist movie, and they shoved Ant-Man in there. That's a great movie. And then they did this a few times. Um, if you take a look at Spider-Man Homecoming, that's the Breakfast Club. That's a great teen angst movie. If you remove Spider-Man, the Spider-Man character himself from that movie still stands up as a good teen angst movie. And you can go through, what is it, the 26 movies of Marvel phase 1 through 4, and you can say, oh, wow. And it all stands up because the beats are there for the movie genre that they picked. And if you contrast that against the DC universe, they made a Batman movie, they made a Superman movie, they made the
It's
other
true.
ones.
And by the way, if I could interrupt real quick, I love your unique perspective on some things. The way you look at things and the way you compare things is so different from how most people would. And I really
That's code
enjoy
for
it.
him going, Aaron is nuts.
But you know what? I love a good nut. Quick, Tara, say something. Why don't you take it for a moment? That works on a lot of
I'm
levels.
just no, I'm just gonna let you guys go because I mean the idea of beats is and that where it would be in the bookstore in the library is a good idea until you hit YA
True.
Oh, no, because that's
because
that's
YA
audience.
is less about the beats and more right. It is audience, but it is a genre, and I know that not everybody here goes into Bowker's and has to pick the genre their books go into, but YA is so you go down and it's like limited. And so you have YA, which is a big genre, but it's going to, if it's YA fantasy, even though it's YA, it's going to be in the YA section, it's going to hit fantasy beats if it's a fantasy. If it's a romance, it should hit the romance beats other than the sex, because we're talking YA. If it's a YA heist, which I have read, I don't know that it was ever actually published because it was in a workshop, so she was working on the manuscript. But it was a wonderful car heist movie with teens. So
There is a lot of good teen YA heist movies out there. We could just look at
Well, Netflix, The Coin Heist is a good YA heist movie.
the Secret Life of Pets.
Oh, yeah.
That's a heist movie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's... And hold on, let me see this here. Sapphire says, no, you're not crazy. I definitely agree with you, Aaron. It's definitely a cool way to think about those movies. It makes total sense. John says, but even Lolita was hard to get out for Vladimir Nabokov because of the topic. Aaron, what are you holding up there? You're crinkling something. You're
Okay.
holding up. What do you got?
So, comic books,
Mhm.
okay? These are YA by definition, okay?
Unless they state
That-
otherwise now.
No, but these are from the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Circa 1992. By definition, YA. But they're not a genre. They were designed for kids since the 1960s, but they in and of themselves are not a genre, which is something I disagree with. YA is an audience. I understand that booksellers make them a genre.
Well, they don't know how else to do it because they've got to group them generally. John, yeah, I agree, not always designed for kids, and that's why I said unless it states otherwise, because in the late 80s, early 90s, they started branching out into some very adult comics, and by that, I don't just mean nudity and sex. I mean, the topic, the you know, the
70s,
story.
60s. Oh yeah, it goes back, but
Right.
um,
But in general, yes.
yeah,
And I would classify comics as a medium.
right.
Vice novels, Vice movies, Vice anime, Vice manga.
Mm-hmm.
But right, but and
Those
again,
are, then you would have genres underneath of that.
right, but it's one of those where the medium is an audience type as well. But I mean, that's neither here nor there when we get into the genre thing, because it's one of those when we're splitting things up. Well, we start talking about, okay, your Artemis Fowl versus your Rick Riordan. Those are completely different subsets. Yeah, they got the same target audience, but they're not the same stories. When we get into the Garth Nixes, again, we're splintering out. Harry Potter, it is not the same.
It wasn't a kid's book either. Was not. I mean, the problem that I think we have when we look at genre is, and like you said, a lot of times an audience
Mm-hmm.
gets labeled a genre, because you could even almost say that about romance. You know, romance, is it truly a genre, or is it an audience, meaning adult women?
Right. And again, a generalization. And that's the thing about genres. They are a generalization. And then you specify a little more than that. Now, Tara, you've made up some genres, or at least wrote books that don't necessarily solidly fit in one genre. Or, yeah, I know, she just made this face for anybody watching the podcast. Like I mentioned, my cyber pulp. And
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the problems. Yeah.
you want to talk a little bit about that,
So,
of what you've made?
and that's why,
Mhm.
you know,
Go on. Go on, Tara.
so I have vampire novels that are YA, but they're also horror, so
Mhm.
I've been told, which I didn't realize. And so
It's got a
some readers
vampire
are
in
like,
it, though.
this belongs in the horror genre.
Hmm. Interesting.
And I'm like, but they're not horror. So, you know, to me, that wasn't the story that I wasn't writing horror, and that wasn't the beats that that weren't the beats I was following. That wasn't the outline or the story arc that I was following. So a lot of times genre is on the receiving end,
That's fair.
and so a lot of times as a publisher, you have to read what you're publishing
Mm-hmm.
and go, okay, where's the audience going to be looking for this kind of novel?
Right.
And I know I've mentioned it before, and hopefully if you're listening, you know what I'm talking about when I say Bowkers. Bowkers is where publishers go to purchase their ISBNs, which are required for your books. And within Bowkers, you have to pick 2 genres, and only 2, which is very, very limiting nowadays, I think.
Yeah, it is.
When the idea of genres and having this label was first, used as a classification or categorization system, it was pretty much Western, romance, epic. It was very delineated. And as people have written books, we have branched out, we've crossed over between genres, so it's now a mess.
I have a question. I'm sorry, Aaron. Did you want to go first?
No. You go
Okay.
ahead. You go first, Travis. I
I
can.
thought Aaron
So,
put his hand up.
for the most part, when we were coming up and we went into our school library to find something new to read, it was very much, here's your reference books, here's your history, here's your fantasy, here's your sci-fi, here's your romance. And there was a couple others, but that kind of covered it all. Now we have so many genres, partially because there's cross pollination across the world. But also, I'm wondering how much is this because we have so many more books out there because we can self publish? What do you guys think? Aaron, do you want to go ahead?
Part of it's because we can self-publish, and part of it's because content creators are getting smarter and smarter, and there's niches that we want to fill. People found this thing and they're like, "Ooh, I like that. I want more of that." They had these. When I mentioned Captain America and the spy stuff, Captain America as a spy is a really, really cool concept, and then the Winter Soldier was introduced in that vein. We want to see those spy stories along that realm. So that niche expands. The market, we fill what the market demands. So we end up with a genre that gets bigger and bigger. The military sci-fi, that it was sci-fi, then it became military, and then you had military, and then you had military sci-fi. But some of it's also the markets didn't know how to deal with this stuff. Whereas in the U.S. we got Balcors, and they go, "Oh, okay, here's this, but you're paying $100 $100 a piece for your ISBN." Well, but if you're in Australia, they're free. If you're in other countries, they don't cost as much, and that's market demand and things like that. If I'm published in Australia, it doesn't cost me anything. I'm gonna friggin' fill them out as much as I want.
Interesting. Tara,
right?
I've got another topic to pull up here, but I want to let you throw any thoughts before I do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and from an anthropological perspective of things, the more you have of something, the more categories you need. And I think that's kind of what we're running into. The very first steampunk novel that was ever published was categorized as science fiction because it was the first one.
Mm-hmm.
And then as more and more authors wrote in that style, that niche, it branched out to where it needed a label of its own. And we're not just labeling the books published this year, the last decade, okay? We have these categories that stretch all the way back a couple of hundred years.
Right.
So when you think of all of those, you end up having more and more genres and subgenres in order to classify what's out there. And the system, when we look at it, it's hard to catch up because ideally, there would be a specific number of something in a category, and then when it hit above that, you would have to break it up. And what we have is, instead of it being just this lovely little root system where you've got the single and all the little branches, you have a spider web, because again, you have, say, steampunk romance, because they made romance a genre when it should be an audience, as Aaron suggested. So
let me read a comment. I'm sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Well, and the old what is it, Kingdom, Phylum, whatever, so on and so forth.
Right.
Freaking cats and dogs don't belong to the same freaking organization. The problem is, when you're talking about books, that can happen. There's nothing to say that the Golden Girls can't be vampire hunters. There's no, or bikers. Why can't they be all three? Why can't Estelle Getty hop on a Harley, run down to Shady Acres, and start killing vampires?
She probably did.
I'm just pointing it out. Go ahead, though,
I'm going to read a couple comments from Sapphire Fox Art Studios here. Genre might be described as what you want to write. The themes we expect, both what we put in as a writer and what we know as a reader reading similar stories, and the way someone interprets the end product, as we mentioned before. Sometimes genre is seen as a strict blueprint, but that's often very limiting. Yeah, there's so many genres. I'm always learning new ones. I learned recently about the genre of weird fiction. So, and the other thing I want to bring up, Tara, you mentioned steampunk, and I wanted to go ahead and bring that up because both you and I have written in that and cosplayed in that and done so many things in that. I don't necessarily want to spend, the last half of the show on it, but I definitely think it needs a few minutes in here because it's something we've enjoyed, but from different angles. And this is a great example of how you take a theme and then you season it with other things, or actually you take a story and then you season it with steampunk. Because last thing I want when I'm reading steampunk is a bunch of technobabble about the cool gizmos. I want the cool gizmos, but I don't want a whole book just describing the aesthetic. Aaron?
Well, okay, so steampunk's really, really easy to classify, okay? On the cover, it has to have a top hat with goggles, and they have to describe mustache wax at least one time in the novel somewhere. That's it. That's how you classify steampunk. One of those two things.
Let's this he's just picking fights right now. Because here's what I'll say. Instead of the top hat and goggles, you could have an airship. There's your two covers. Top hat and goggles.
Okay. That's not exclusive either.
Or an airship.
Okay, I'm sorry. If it has any of those three things, it's automatically steampunk.
And cogs and gears. And brown. And Tara, do you want to open up some thoughts on
Unless
this?
it's me, because I do steampunk in black and purple. Yeah, because I came into steampunk by way of Victorian Gothic. And it's an extension for me of the Victorian Gothic. So there's a lot of Gothic in my steampunk, especially in the Mechanics of Life that's out now. And so there's steampunk, and it is, I think, when it first became its own genre, it was very, very specific.
Yeah, I agree.
Type of steampunk, and that has broadened as folks have come into the genre from other genres. My interpretation of steampunk, coming from the Victorian Gothic, is very different, I think, than Travis's interpretation of steampunk. And it's simply because we arrived there by a different venue. And I think that's something that's, broadens a genre. But I think as long as you call it that genre, like Raven said, the genre is what you want to write. If you're going to write and you're like, I'm going to write steampunk, if that's what you're thinking when you're writing, you're probably writing steampunk. There's going to be other stuff in there. Mine have Gothic elements, horror elements too. That someone keeps pointing out to me, that's a horror element. I'm like, it is? Because I don't really do horror, but
but Gothic and the horror come side to side.
Exactly. That's but what other folks are looking at and saying, calling horror, I'm looking at that as Gothic.
Right. And that makes sense.
So to me, I'm writing Gothic and steampunk.
Yeah.
And meshing them together. And so to me, that's what I'm writing. And that's, genre's this amoeba thing that I think it has to be flexible.
I agree.
But
with the steampunk that I've written, I did themes within them. I have a detective story or possibly spy story with Croker Norge and Phoebus Buckrow in the Croker Ford Norge case files. I have Lovecraftian type horror in the Tridington Birthright. And then in my trio of travelers, it's got time travel blended in with these three and jumping to different worlds, dimensions, realities, however you want to look at through the multiverse. So yeah, it's got a lot to it, and that, if we take this whole conversation and replace the word steampunk with anything else, romance we've already kind of touched on, sci-fi, there's so many other things where you have, this is your base, but how you build on top of it You know, because some people with steampunk, they want that beautiful utopian feel. Other people want that dark gothic feel, that nitty gritty, almost a 1930s detective feel, but back.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
as an example, Doctor Who.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. On its face is a sci-fi, but the more you look at it, it's steampunk.
Well, it's
I mean,
Doctor Who is a beautiful example of here's everything. If you
well,
don't,
it is,
yeah.
it is, but thematically,
Mm-hmm.
And a giant go.
right, no, I mean thematically, not as a visual element, it has got very much steampunk-esque. I'm not saying it's steampunk, but we're all very wibbly wobbly. You go in there and like, oh, we got these buttons and levers and things like that. Now sometimes they put electronic gizmos to make it do its thing, especially in the more modern episodes. But before, oh, yeah, we got a glowy light and a friggin' pull lever and stuff like that.
Well, we've definitely seen classic horror. We've definitely seen hard sci-fi, military sci-fi. We've seen historical pieces. We've seen
Yes.
everything across the board with Doctor Who, which is one of the things I really enjoy about it, because if I don't like this episode, wait. The next
Wait
episode.
2 episodes, it'll be different.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to read this comment here. Sapphire Fox says, just like with cyberpunk, there's dark and gritty cyberpunk, and there's very bright and hopeful. But generally, when you tack the word punk onto something, it insinuates something a bit darker. You know, a bit rebellious against whatever system you're working in. Tara, do you have some stuff to add? I've seen you wiggling.
I think she's still angry at the top hat comment.
No. I just, with when we were talking about Doctor Who, and Aaron says, well, so steampunk. I'm like, because my take is it is so Victorian Gothic.
That as well.
Perception.
And what a lot of folks, again, yeah, because it's where you're coming from, and I think, like you said, it's the beauty of Doctor Who. It's all in there, and so you see the elements that you're familiar with, and from what you've come with, because there are,
Yeah.
it's one of the Christmas ones.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, oh, it's so steampunk. And I'm looking at it, I'm watching, I'm like, no, it's Victorian.
Right. It's Dickens.
So if someone's only seen steampunk and never, then they're going to look at it and they're going to go, oh, this is so steampunk. But if it's someone who's more familiar with, say, Victorian and the Gothic, they're going to look at it and go, oh, that's pure Victorian Gothic.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the audience has a lot to do with genre. And when you're writing as the author, you have a genre that you're aiming for, but your end product might not be exactly in the genre that you were aiming for, because a lot of it,
Yeah.
it's the audience, and that's where you have to worry about. That's because you need to make sure that it's they're going to find it.
Now, I have a question here. For me, I always have a base genre in mind. But actually, when I'm done with the book, it can be very different. And it's hard to pick that genre when I'm choosing how to list it, whether with your 2-genre thing with Belkers or with Amazon when you're listing your book and self-publishing it. To find the perfect one, and also it's a juggling act between what you have in there and then what extra elements and how do you pull different audiences, because there's a power in having this broad spectrum genre that everybody knows, and there's also a power in pulling from the niche audience who loves this because they're very passionate and they gobble up everything they can because there's not a lot of it out there. So how do you guys go about that? Aaron, you've got a new book you're working on, and this kind of goes into that too.
So on this one, I worked under the premise of Harry Potter in space. There's not a whole lot of young adult stuff that starts off in space, and then I realized that in the true space odyssey, space opera stuff, I don't and this is keeping in mind that I'm old. Um, so I don't see, and at least from the era that I come from, the woman lead for the juvenile novels, at least in the Heinlein-esque, you've got the Podkane of Mars and a couple others, but you don't have a whole lot of women-led juvenile novels, at least for the space opera stuff. It's more common now, but I'm not looking at your Mockingjays. I'm not looking at that style, that tone. I'm looking for something a little bit more optimistic, and I'm trying to get that very much Harry Potter in space feel, as opposed to a dystopian. So that's where I went with. So I'm building up from the ground up, but I want that fast-paced pulp. So I start with the big one. It's going to be sci-fi. That's category 1, and then space opera is probably going to be category 2. They're both sci-fi. One's underlaid under the other, but the cool part about being strictly web is I can change it anytime I want. If that one's not working, move it to another one.
It's true.
Uh,
Tara?
whereas it,
I'm sorry, Aaron. Finish up, Aaron.
whereas once it's in print, you're stuck with it. Or if you got an assigned ISBN, you're stuck with it until you buy another one.
And Tara, you've written in so many different genres under multiple pen names. So I'm guessing this is something you've struggled with also.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
When I write and I have my pen names kind of not exactly divided by genre, but kind of more by audience. So I have a younger YA, middle grade to younger YA pen name. And right now I write fantasy there. I have E.G. Gaddis where I write my Victorian vampire and my steampunk novels because that, they kind of go together.
Right.
They have that gothic in them, except for Clan Campbell, because that was different, because when I wrote those I was writing, first steampunk and a slightly younger audience, and still put E.G. Gaddis on them because I'm like, I don't need another pen name.
Right.
And then I have some contemporary YA that I write that's very contemporary, meaning it takes place like in the present, and it's and I have a pen name for that. But then it's kind of weird there because I have one that's very, very, very realistic, Waiting for Normal. And then I have Little Pink Book that, oh wow, takes place in the same damn high school. Oops, there's a swear word. I'm the first one to swear, I think. Except it's got some definite horror elements in it, as people keep telling me, and a magical aspect to it with this book that can do magical things and then hurt you. So I kind of debated, is it still, I'm like, okay, you know what?
Yeah.
It's still for that same audience, I think. So it's there, and then everything else I just put out is Tara Moeller, and it's a mishmash of whatever the heck else comes out of me, or that I feel just doesn't quite fit within those other realms that I've created. And it's sometimes hard because I really struggled with the Clan Campbell books because they were for a very similar the similar reading audience age group as what I write my SEL Fry for the middle grade younger YA fantasy. But it's steampunk, and it was like, well, where do I put it? And eventually it was like toss of a coin, which so often that's how, when you're in Bowkers, and you can go in and change the genres in Bowkers. All right, you're not set in stone, and you don't need to get another ISBN to change that. But you do have to think about it, because that's what the bookstore, the library is going to look at to figure out where to put your book. And again, it is based more on audience. And that's who you really have to think of, is think almost as genre as your audience, as who is going to want to read this, and go about it that way.
Very good. Let's do some closing thoughts on this topic. Aaron, did you want to reply to that and then give your closing thoughts afterwards?
Yep. Quick one on that. It's not even necessarily who's going to want to read it. It's who's going to want to order it. So you're looking at the bookstores, you're looking at your libraries and things like that. So they're looking at filling sections because everything's library space. Just like behind me, I've got one of these IKEA shelves, and I've only got so much space that I could put on it to display my stuff. They've only got so much space on their thing, and they're looking, oh, I need to, you know what, I got to have a good YA shelf. And as their stuff, they're trying to rotate stock. So they want to make sure that this stuff's getting old, we're going to transfer it over to another library. They want to fill it back up. So you got to make sure that they've got, our military seems to be hot, let's get some more stuff in here. And they're playing rotating stock, so you got to make sure that the buyer is your target audience on that one for the ISBNs more so than anything else. Whereas on Amazon, where you're targeting individuals for your individual purchases, I think.
Let me ask a question here in chat. Sapphire Fox says, do you think about the genre more before or after creating the book? How often have you had the genre shift during the writing process? I'll jump on this, and after we each answer this question, we'll do our closing thoughts on this. Often. At least the second genre. Because I always have, this is a fantasy world, this is a sci-fi world, etc. So I have kind of the big overhead umbrella, but that subgenre can definitely shift. It did with Silver and Smith, as I'm like, this is cyberpunk, and I'm like, nope, cyberpunk doesn't quite fit it. I'm not hitting all those tropes. I want something else, and I made up my own of this cyber pulp. With Portals, I'm like, this is fantasy. By the time I was done, I'm like, this is swords and sorcery. It's also borderline lit RPG or game lit, and it's also, I can't think of the name, the one where you portal to a different world. What's the term? Anybody remember that?
No.
Begins with an I believe. Not Imelda Marcos. That's the one with the shoes. But yeah, I can't think of it. But yes. Tara, what about you? How often do you have yours shift, if at all? There we go. Isekai.
The main genre has not. I've never had a true shift in, like, the main genre. Most of what I write is YA. Right now. I mean, that I've published. It's YA. Adult stuff gets published as Tara Moeller. And there's a couple in there that I just didn't know what to do with. Desolation of Fog is weird fiction, probably. Except I'm not familiar with that. So, that was said in jest. So,
yeah,
like you said, the main, I have to, when I go in, I have an idea of the world that it's going to be set in, whether it's fantasy, whether it's modern time, whether it's steampunk or in the Victorian, but I would definitely Victorian fiction, vampire, so it is not historic. Did I try to make it as historically accurate as I could? Yes. But it's certainly not historic fiction. It's got vampires in it. I wish there was a genre called vampire fiction, because then it would fit, because really I don't know. Is it true Gothic? Maybe.
Okay. Now, what about you, Aaron? Because I know you're a heavy outliner, so you have a plan, and then a bigger plan, and then an overall plan as you write. Do you ever find yours shifting in the middle?
Absolutely. So there's two parts to this one. So I actually have timers that go off right at the beginning of May, right at the beginning of November, that I go and revisit for Persona non grata every year, because Memorial Day and Veterans Day, I do a charity event where all the proceeds from the book for that month um, go to one of the veterans charities.
Nice.
So I go in there, I revisit the categories, and I make sure that they're the most apt they can be for those 2 months. Um, so I adjust them to what I think they're gonna hit the best with, and then I send it out to my mailing list and say, hey, just so you guys know, for all contributions to KDP and whatever book sales I happen to have, here they are. Um, Send it to your friends, send it to your family, let whatever it is, it's 100% straight to. Um, and then I hit it on again. It's about 6 months apart. And then while I'm actually writing it, typically sci-fi right off the bat. YA, Icarus Black's going to be sci-fi and YA. The sci-fi is probably going to change. The YA is going to YA, middle grade, so on and so forth, as the books are doing its thing. But we're going to hit other themes as we go along. And with the breadth of this novel series, not every book's going to be in the same category, because the more there are, the more that I want them to spread across there, and
That's
they're going to
fair.
fall into the same ruling. Because why have book 1 and book 2 in the same exact categories? It doesn't make sense. If they find book 1, they're going to find book 2.
That's fair.
If they find
So, what about your closing thoughts on genres and subgenres? What do you got?
genres and subgenres, it's flavors. It's like going into Baskin Robbins. You're gonna find one. It's all ice cream. They're all stories you want to tell. It's all flavors. There's nothing bad there. If it was bad, it would have got cut out long ago. Now you're gonna find stuff that you really want to have that day. Is it gonna be pistachio ice cream? Is it gonna be coffee ice cream? What you're looking for, something that you want. So you're gonna find something you want. It's just a case of, oh, what do I want today? So the genres and subgenres, it's just nuance of, oh, this is what I'm after. But for us, what kind of story? How much chocolate syrup am I gonna put on it today? How much gothic horror? How much vampire? How much steampunk? What's the sprinkles gonna look like? And how much is the audience gonna notice? As I said, Persona non grata is it's not really military sci-fi. It's science fiction pulp, but it hits more people on science fiction military, or it hits more military sci-fi than anything else, because pulp's not really something that people are looking for in that genre.
Tara?
As a publisher, genre and subgenres are very important, and I think you have to know what they are, because it helps you if you know your genre, you know your subgenre. As a publisher, it helps you to determine the audience, and as a self-published writer, that will help you to determine your audience and who you need to make contact with in order to introduce your
Right.
book to them, in order to start that content that will hopefully turn into sales for you.
Very good. Then my closing thoughts are something I wanted to talk about, but we've kind of run out of time on this episode, is I want to see more female sci-fi, especially military sci-fi. It's out there. It has been out there for decades, but it's not very common. But I would like to see this because I don't enjoy the other stuff as much as I could, and I feel like a little louder, Tara. What?
Check out Placebo by Tara Moeller then.
There you go. Okay.
So check out Placebo by Tara Moeller.
Gotcha.
Where can we get that?
www.dreampunkpress.com
There
or
you
from
go.
Amazon.
But yeah, know your genre, know your audience, use it as a writer to target the people that you think will be interested in your book. And don't just throw genres in there to pull in more audience if it doesn't actually apply to your book. But it's a constant learning process and growing process and changing process. Okay, let's get that outro here, and we will catch you guys on the next episode.
Before we go, I want to remind everyone that you can email us at writenightshow@gmail.com. That's right with a W, night with an N, show@gmail.com. To let us know your thoughts on the show's topic, suggest other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or just have a message read out on air to someone in your life. Thanks to everyone for supporting the show by downloading the podcast, sharing it on social media, grabbing some shirt stickers and mugs from bit.ly/tavern merch, or barware patches and hats from bit.ly/tavern merch too. That's bit.ly/tavern merch or tavern merch followed by the number 2. Thanks to everyone who joined us live at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and everyone who supports the tavern by subscribing, hosting, throwing bits, raids, and most of all, commenting.
Thank you for joining author Travis I. Sivart and the other writers, content creators, and all-around amazing people for our discussion here on Writing. Join us again soon, and until you do, make sure you create with passion, enjoy the journey, and remember, every night can be right enough.